On September 12, 1897, in the rugged mountains of what is now Pakistan, 21 Sikh soldiers faced an impossible choice. Before them stretched a sea of enemy warriors, 10,000 strong, their war cries echoing through the valleys like thunder. Behind them lay two isolated British forts, cut off from reinforcement, their garrisons watching helplessly as the storm approached. The odds were beyond comprehension. One defender for every 500 attackers, yet these men, led by a battle-hardened sergeant named Havildar Ishar Singh, would make a decision that would echo through history and leave the world in stunned disbelief. This is not just another tale of military courage. This is the story of the Battle of Saragarhi, a last stand so extraordinary that when news reached the British Parliament, members rose to their feet in spontaneous ovation. So remarkable that it has been compared to the legendary 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, so inspiring that UNESCO has recognized it as one of the 8 most significant acts of collective bravery in human history. What unfolded in those mountain passes would redefine what it means to fight against impossible odds. The year 1897 found the British Empire stretched thin across the volatile northwest frontier, a lawless region where tribal warriors had resisted foreign rule for centuries. Here, in the shadow of the Hindu Kush Mountains, the Samana Range cut through the landscape like a jagged spine. British forces clung to isolated outposts, connected only by precarious communication lines and the courage of the men who manned them. It was a place where empires came to test their resolve, where the margin between victory and annihilation was measured not in miles, but in minutes. At the heart of this treacherous frontier stood Saragarhi, a small village that had become far more important than its size suggested. Perched on a rocky outcrop between two vital British strongholds, Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, it served as the crucial link in a chain of communication that kept the entire region from falling into chaos. The post was manned by soldiers of the 36th Sikhs, men drawn from the fertile plains of Punjab, who would trade their plows for rifles in service to the crown. But Saragarhi was more than just another military outpost. It was a lifeline. Using an ingenious system of mirrors and reflected sunlight called heliographic communication, the signalmen at Saragarhi could flash coded messages between the isolated forts, coordinating defenses and calling for reinforcement when danger threatened. Without this vital link, the two larger garrisons would be fighting blind, cut off from each other and from the outside world. The men who held Saragarhi held the key to the survival of hundreds of their comrades. The leader of this small garrison was a man whose very presence seemed to embody the contradictions of frontier warfare. Havildar Ishar Singh had been born in 1,858 inches, a village near Jagraon, in the heart of Punjab's agricultural heartland. At 18, he had enlisted in the Punjab Frontier Force, drawn by the promise of steady pay and the chance to serve alongside men who shared his Sikh faith and warrior traditions. By 1887, he had transferred to the 36th Sikhs, where his superiors would come to know him as a complex figure, brilliant in battle yet difficult in peacetime. British military records would later describe Singh with a characterization that captured the essence of the man. Ishar Singh was a somewhat turbulent character whose independent nature had brought him more than once into conflict with his military superiors. Thus, Ishar Singh, in camp a nuisance, in the field magnificent. It was this very independence, this refusal to bow to convention, that would prove crucial in the hours to come. Singh was a man who thought for himself, who weighed honor against survival and chose his path accordingly. At 39 years old, Singh commanded not just respect, but genuine loyalty from the men under his charge. His garrison consisted of 20 other soldiers, including 2 non-commissioned officers and 18 sepoys, all veterans of the harsh frontier campaigns that had shaped them. These were not green recruits fresh from training, but seasoned warriors who had learned their trade in the unforgiving mountains, where mistakes meant death and hesitation meant defeat. The summer of 1897 had been particularly volatile along the northwest frontier. Tribal unrest simmered like water in a kettle, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. The Pashtun warriors, who had never fully accepted British rule, were stirring with talk of jihad and liberation. Their leaders spoke of driving the foreign invaders from their ancestral lands, of reclaiming the passes and peaks that had been theirs for generations before the British had ever dreamed of empire. Intelligence reports filtering back to British headquarters spoke of large gatherings in the tribal territories, of weapons being distributed and war councils being held under the cover of darkness. The signs were unmistakable to anyone who understood the rhythms of frontier warfare. A storm was building, and when it broke, the isolated British outposts would bear the full fury of tribal wrath. As September dawned, the atmosphere along the Samana Range grew increasingly tense. Patrols reported unusual activity in the valleys below, the movement of large groups of armed men who melted away into the rocks whenever British forces approached. The heliograph stations worked overtime, flashing messages between the scattered posts as commanders tried to piece together the intelligence and prepare for what seemed inevitable. Lieutenant Colonel John Horton, commanding the 36th Sikhs from Fort Lockhart, found himself in an impossible position. His forces were stretched across multiple outposts, each one vulnerable if attacked in strength. The terrain made rapid reinforcement nearly impossible, and the tribal forces gathering in the valleys outnumbered his entire regiment many times over. Every decision carried the weight of hundreds of lives. Every deployment could mean the difference between holding the line and watching the entire frontier collapse. The strategic importance of the region could not be overstated. The passes through the Samana Range controlled access to the settled districts beyond, where millions of British subjects lived and worked under the protection of the Raj. If the tribal forces could break through and reach the plains, the consequences would be catastrophic. Villages would burn, trade routes would be severed, and the carefully constructed edifice of British rule would crack along its most vulnerable frontier. For the men at Saragarhi, these grand strategic concerns felt distant compared to the immediate realities of their situation. They could see the dust clouds rising from the valleys as large bodies of men moved through the passes. They could hear the echo of war drums carried on the mountain winds. They knew, with the instinct of veterans, that their quiet posting was about to become the epicenter of something terrible and magnificent. The communication equipment at Saragarhi represented the cutting edge of military technology for its time. The heliograph system required precise alignment of mirrors to reflect sunlight in coded flashes, a delicate operation that demanded both technical skill and steady nerves. As the first week of September passed, the frequency of heliograph traffic increased dramatically. Messages flew between the posts reporting tribal movements, requesting supplies, coordinating patrol schedules. The men at Saragarhi found themselves at the center of a web of communication that stretched across hundreds of square miles of hostile territory. They were no longer just soldiers defending a position. They had become the nerve center of British resistance in the region. Yet even as the tension mounted, few could have predicted the sheer scale of what was approaching. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 12th, the valleys around Saragarhi began to fill with a sight that would have chilled the blood of any seasoned frontier fighter. Thousands upon thousands of tribal warriors emerged from the mountain passes like a dark tide, their white robes ghostly in the moonlight, their weapons glinting as the first rays of sun touched the peaks above. The Afridi and Orakzai tribesmen had answered the call to arms in numbers that staggered even their own leaders. Village after village had emptied as men took up their rifles and swords, driven by a combination of religious fervor, tribal pride, and the ancient hatred of foreign rule that burned in their hearts. They came from settlements scattered across the rugged frontier, united by a common cause that transcended the petty feuds and rivalries that normally kept them apart. From his vantage point at Fort Lockhart, Lieutenant Colonel Horton watched through his field glasses as the enemy force assembled in the valley below. What he saw defied comprehension. Standards and banners dotted the landscape like flowers in a deadly garden, each one representing 1,000 warriors or more. By his count, at least 14 major tribal contingents had converged on the area, creating an army that numbered somewhere between 12 and 20,000 men. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. These were not the ragged bands of raiders that British forces had grown accustomed to fighting. This was a coordinated tribal army, organized and determined, moving with purpose toward objectives that had been carefully planned. The dust clouds raised by their march could be seen for miles, a brown smudge against the clear mountain air that spoke of an unstoppable force gathering momentum. At 9 o'clock that morning, as the sun climbed higher over the Samana Range, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh bent over his heliograph apparatus and began flashing a message that would mark the beginning of one of history's most extraordinary battles. His mirror caught the sunlight and threw it toward Fort Lockhart in a series of precise flashes that spelled out words no garrison commander ever wants to receive. We are under attack. Enemy strength approximately 10,000. Request immediate assistance. The response came back within minutes, but it was not what the defenders had hoped to hear. Colonel Horton's reply was stark in its honesty and devastating in its implications. Cannot send immediate help to Saragarhi. You must hold your position at all costs. The fate of Fort Gulistan and Fort Lockhart depends on your actions. Godspeed. In that moment, the 21 men of the Saragarhi garrison understood their situation with crystal clarity. They were alone, outnumbered by odds that made victory impossible and survival unlikely. The nearest friendly forces were miles away, separated by terrain that would take hours to cross even under the best conditions. The enemy was already at their gates, and reinforcement was not coming. Havildar Ishar Singh gathered his men in the small courtyard of the outpost as the sound of approaching war cries grew louder. These soldiers, hardened by years of frontier service, looked to their leader for guidance in what they all knew might be their final hour. Some were young men barely out of their teens. Others were grizzled veterans who had seen action across the length and breadth of the empire. All of them understood the choice that lay before them. Singh's words, as recorded by the signalman still flashing messages to Fort Lockhart, would echo through military history. The enemy offers us terms if we surrender the post and withdraw. We have ammunition for perhaps 400 rounds per man. We are outnumbered beyond all reasonable odds. I call upon each of you to decide for yourselves whether we should attempt to escape and save our lives, or whether we should stand and fight for the honor of the regiment and the safety of our comrades in the other forts. The response was immediate and unanimous. To a man, the defenders of Saragarhi chose to fight. They would not abandon their post, would not leave their comrades blind and defenseless, would not give ground to an enemy that sought to drive British rule from the frontier. In that moment, 21 ordinary soldiers transformed themselves into something extraordinary. They became men willing to die for principles larger than themselves. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh flashed the final message to Fort Lockhart, a simple word that carried the weight of destiny. Understood. Then he turned away from his heliograph to take up his rifle, knowing that his next duty was not to communicate but to fight. The first assault came like a thunderclap. Thousands of tribal warriors surged forward across the rocky ground, their battle cries rising to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very mountains. They came in waves, some carrying scaling ladders, others wielding axes and swords, all of them driven by the fury of men fighting for their homeland against foreign occupiers. The defenders of Saragarhi met them with disciplined volleys that cut swaths through the attacking ranks. These were soldiers trained in the finest traditions of British military doctrine, men who could load and fire their rifles with mechanical precision even under the most intense pressure. Their first shot sent dozens of attackers tumbling to the ground. But for every man who fell, two more seemed to take his place. The narrow confines of the outpost worked both for and against the defenders. They were fighting with their backs to the wall in the most literal sense, every step backward bringing them closer to the final stand that they all knew was coming. Wave after wave of attackers threw themselves against the stone walls of Saragarhi, only to be driven back by the deadly accurate fire of the defenders. The tribesmen tried every tactic they knew, rushing the gate with battering rams, attempting to scale the walls with ladders, even trying to tunnel under the fortifications. Each assault was met with fierce resistance that left the ground littered with bodies. But the defenders' ammunition was running dangerously low, and more enemies seemed to appear for everyone that fell. By midday, the situation had become desperate. The walls of Saragarhi showed the scars of hours of continuous fighting, pockmarked with bullet holes and stained with the blood of both attackers and defenders. Several of the Sikh soldiers had been wounded, though none had fallen, and their ammunition supplies were dwindling at an alarming rate. Still they fought on, knowing that every minute they held was another minute for the other forts to prepare their defenses. The tribal commanders, frustrated by their inability to overwhelm what should have been an insignificant obstacle, began to concentrate their efforts on a single section of the outer wall. Using axes and crowbars, teams of warriors worked to create a breach while their comrades provided covering fire. The defenders poured everything they had into stopping this concentrated assault, but the sheer weight of numbers began to tell. With a rumble that seemed to shake the earth itself, a section of the wall finally gave way. Chunks of stone tumbled inward as tribal warriors poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. The outer defenses of Saragarhi had been breached, and the final phase of the battle was about to begin. The breach in the outer wall opened like a wound in the stone, and through it poured a torrent of screaming warriors. Steel clashed against steel as the tribal fighters met the Sikh defenders in the narrow courtyard, transforming the confined space into a maelstrom of hand-to-hand combat. The disciplined volleys that had held the enemy at bay for hours gave way to the brutal intimacy of bayonet and sword, where survival depended not on tactics but on raw courage and the will to strike first. Havildar Ishar Singh found himself at the heart of the melee, his sword cutting through the press of bodies as he fought to rally his men for one final stand. Around him, his soldiers battled with the ferocity of cornered lions, each man knowing that surrender was not an option and that death was the only alternative to victory. The courtyard echoed with the clash of weapons and the cries of wounded men, while overhead the sun continued its merciless climb toward its zenith. The defenders had prepared for this moment, knowing that once the walls were breached, their only hope lay in the inner stronghold of the post itself. Singh ordered his surviving men to fall back to the central tower, a stone structure that offered better protection and fields of fire than the exposed courtyard. One by one, the Sikhs fought their way toward this last refuge, covering each other's retreat with disciplined fire even as the enemy pressed closer with each passing second. But the tribal warriors had learned from their earlier assaults. Instead of rushing forward in disorganized waves, they advanced methodically, using the bodies of their fallen comrades as cover while they worked to surround the remaining defenders. Their leaders had recognized the quality of their opponents and adjusted their tactics accordingly, bringing the patience of mountain hunters to bear against prey that refused to be easily taken. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the situation inside the inner stronghold grew increasingly desperate. The defenders were down to their last few rounds of ammunition, and several more had fallen to enemy fire. The stone walls that had seemed so solid that morning now felt like a tomb, echoing with the sound of axes and rifle butts as the attackers worked to break through the heavy wooden door that stood between them and their quarry. Sept Gurmukh Singh, the signalman who had faithfully transmitted the battle's progress to Fort Lockhart, found himself in the impossible position of being both chronicler and participant in the final act of the drama. His heliograph equipment lay shattered from enemy fire, the mirrors that had connected Saragarhi to the outside world reduced to glittering fragments scattered across the floor. Now he clutched his rifle with hands that had grown steady despite hours of continuous fighting, preparing to sell his life as dearly as possible. The sound of splintering wood announced the moment they had all been dreading. The door to the inner stronghold sagged on its hinges, then burst inward in a shower of splinters and iron fittings. Through the gap poured a flood of tribal warriors, their faces blackened with powder smoke, their weapons gleaming with blood and sweat. The final confrontation had begun, and there would be no quarter asked or given. What followed was combat stripped of all pretense and strategy, reduced to its most elemental form. Men grappled with each other in the confined space, using rifle butts and bayonets when ammunition ran out, fighting with knives and bare hands when their weapons broke or were torn from their grasp. The air grew thick with smoke and dust, making it difficult to distinguish friend from foe in the deadly chaos that engulfed the chamber. One by one, the defenders of Saragarhi fell to the overwhelming numbers arrayed against them. Each man fought until his strength failed, buying precious seconds for his comrades with his blood and courage. The stone floor grew slippery with gore as the battle raged back and forth across the narrow confines of the tower, neither side willing to yield an inch of ground without exacting a terrible price from their opponents. Havildar Ishar Singh, wounded in half a dozen places but still standing, found himself pressed back against the far wall of the chamber. Around him lay the bodies of his men, soldiers who had followed him into this impossible fight and given their lives without complaint or hesitation. His sword, heated to red hot from the friction of continuous combat, felt like molten metal in his hands, but still he swung it with deadly precision against the enemies who pressed forward to finish what they had started. The end came not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual recognition that the impossible had been achieved and then surpassed. The tribal warriors, expecting to overwhelm their opponents through sheer weight of numbers, found themselves engaged in a battle of attrition that cost them dearly for every step forward. Bodies piled upon bodies in the narrow chamber, creating obstacles that hindered their own advance while providing cover for the few defenders still capable of resistance. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, true to his role as the post's communicator, found his voice one final time as the enemy closed in around him. His battle cry echoed through the smoke-filled chamber, a defiant shout that carried the pride and faith of his people into the gathering darkness. Bole so nihal, Sat Sri Akal. The words rang out above the clash of weapons and the groans of wounded men, a final declaration that some things were more precious than life itself. The tribal commanders, watching from outside the tower as their men fought to clear the last pockets of resistance, began to understand the true cost of their victory. The ground around Saragarhi was carpeted with their dead and wounded, hundreds of warriors who had fallen to the rifles and bayonets of just 21 defenders. What should have been a brief skirmish on the road to greater conquests had become a charnel house that would haunt the memory of every survivor. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the sounds of battle gradually faded into an ominous silence. The post of Saragarhi had finally fallen, its defenders overwhelmed after nearly 8 hours of continuous fighting that had tested the limits of human endurance and courage. Smoke rose from the shattered buildings where fires had been set to burn out the last defenders, while the tribal warriors began the grim task of counting their losses. The delay caused by the fierce resistance at Saragarhi had unexpected consequences that rippled across the entire campaign. The tribal forces, bloodied and exhausted by their costly victory, found their momentum blunted just when they needed it most. The hours lost in reducing what should have been a minor obstacle had given the defenders of Fort Gulistan precious time to prepare their defenses and call for reinforcement from the main British garrison. When the tribal army finally turned its attention to the larger prize of Fort Gulistan, they found not a surprised and unprepared garrison but a fortress ready for siege. Artillery pieces had been positioned to command the approaches, ammunition had been distributed, and relief columns were already marching through the mountain passes toward the sound of the guns. The window of opportunity that might have allowed the capture of the fort had closed, sealed by the sacrifice of 21 men who had chosen duty over survival. The relief column that finally reached Saragarhi on the morning of September 13th found a scene of devastation that spoke eloquently of the ferocity of the battle that had raged there. The stone walls were pockmarked with bullet holes and stained dark with blood, while the courtyard was littered with the debris of war. Broken weapons, torn clothing, and expended cartridge cases told the story of men who had fought with everything they possessed until nothing remained to give. Among the ruins, the bodies of the 21 defenders were found where they had fallen, some still clutching their weapons, others with their hands raised as if in final defiance of the enemy who had overwhelmed them. The respect shown by the tribal warriors was evident in the careful arrangement of the bodies, a recognition of courage that transcended the religious and cultural divisions that had brought these men into conflict. The Battle of Saragarhi stands as proof that courage is not measured by numbers, but by the willingness to face impossible odds for something greater than oneself. 21 men, outnumbered 500 to 1, held their ground for 8 hours and changed the course of history. Their sacrifice saved 2 forts, inspired a nation, and earned recognition from the British Parliament to UNESCO as one of humanity's greatest acts of collective bravery. In an age of cynicism, their story reminds us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they choose honor over survival,